Miss Gray told me I was destined for mediocrity. Her exact words were average at best. 10 years later, her unemployed son was sitting in my boardroom, begging for a job. She had no idea I was the CEO. When I walked through those doors and slid his rejected resume across the table, her face went white. Sometimes the quiet ones surprise you. The email notification chimed at 6:47 a.m., just as I was finishing my morning workout in my penthouse gym. Sweat still beading on my forehead, I checked my phone out of habit, a CEO's curse, never truly disconnected. The message was from our HR director, Sandra, marked high priority. Unusual situation with today's 10 a.m. interview. Mother is insisting on accompanying the candidate. Should I reschedule? I paused mid-stretch, something about the situation nagging at me. Helicopter parents weren't uncommon in tech, but they rarely made it past our initial screening. Our company culture prized independence and innovation, qualities that didn't typically flourish under parental supervision. "Send me the candidate's file," I typed back. "I'll handle the interview personally." 20 minutes later, I found myself staring at a name that made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips. Marcus Gray. The surname hit me like a physical blow, dragging me back 15 years to the worst period of my adolescence. Gray. It couldn't be a coincidence. Before we dive deeper into the story of vindication and unexpected turns, I want to invite you to join our community of survivors and thrivers. If you're drawn to stories of people who refuse to be defined by others' limitations, consider subscribing. It costs nothing and connects you with thousands who understand that sometimes the best response to doubt is proving them spectacularly wrong. Now, let's return to that morning when the past came knocking on my office door. Marcus Gray's resume painted a picture of mediocrity that would have been familiar to his mother. Recent college graduate from a mid-tier state school, 2.8 GPA, limited work experience, laid off from his first job after 6 months, a scattering of odd jobs, retail, food service, and a brief stint at a marketing firm that ended badly. Nothing that would typically warrant a second glance from Chen Digital Solutions' competitive hiring process. But this wasn't about qualifications. This was about his mother and the ghost of a conversation that had haunted me for over a decade. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, surrounded by the trappings of success I'd never imagined at 16. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Seattle's skyline, the Space Needle piercing morning clouds like a symbol of ambitious dreams realized. Awards lined my mahogany shelves. Forbes 30 Under 30, Tech Innovator of the Year, multiple patents for algorithms that had revolutionized supply chain management. None of it would have existed if I'd listened to Miss Gray. The memory came flooding back with vivid clarity. October 15th, 2009. I'd worn my lucky sweater, a faded purple cardigan that made me feel slightly less invisible, and rehearsed my request for a schedule change dozens of times in the hallway mirror outside the guidance office. Miss Gray's office had been a shrine to academic mediocrity. Motivational posters with sunset backgrounds proclaimed generic wisdom, "Reach for the stars," and "Every student is special." But her desk told a different story. Stacks of college brochures for community colleges and trade schools, rejection letters from universities that students had aimed too high for, and a coffee mug that read, "Reality check."
"Brooke Chen," she'd said without looking up when I knocked hesitantly on her open door. Her voice carried the weary tone of someone who'd crushed dreams for 2 decades and considered it a public service. "Your grades are concerning." I remember the exact layout of that office. Artificial plant in the corner, she'd killed the real one years ago, a motivational calendar turned to the wrong month, and a framed photo of her family. A younger Marcus grinning gap-toothed beside his father, both of them looking at Miss Gray with adoration she seemed incapable of returning. I was hoping we could discuss changing my schedule. I'd begun, my voice barely above a whisper. At 16, I was already an expert at making myself small, at occupying as little space as possible to avoid notice. "Let me save you some time," she'd interrupted, finally glancing up with tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that had probably been stylish in 1987. "You're a C-average student with no extracurricular involvement, no leadership potential, no particular talents that I can see." The words had landed like physical blows, each one precisely aimed at insecurities I'd spent years trying to hide. I was the kid who ate lunch alone in the library, who never raised her hand in class, who faded into the background so completely that teachers sometimes forgot to mark me present. "Some students are destined for greatness," Miss Gray had continued, returning to her paperwork with dismissive finality. "Others are meant for average lives. There's nothing wrong with being ordinary, Brooke. The sooner you accept that, the happier you'll be." She denied my schedule change request with a rubber stamp that read "Denied" in red ink, a stamp she'd probably used thousands of times to crush similar hopes. Said switching classes wouldn't magically transform me into someone I wasn't. Suggested I consider more realistic electives, basic computer skills instead of advanced programming, remedial math instead of pre-calculus. I'd left her office that day feeling smaller than when I'd entered, her assessment echoing in my mind like a death sentence that would define the rest of my life. Average at best. That night, I sat in my childhood bedroom, walls covered with generic inspirational quotes my well-meaning parents had hung to boost my confidence, staring at my reflection in the vanity mirror my grandmother had given me. The girl looking back seemed to confirm Miss Gray's assessment. Unremarkable features, clothes chosen for invisibility rather than style, eyes that held more doubt than determination. My parents, both hardworking immigrants who'd sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they'd never had, found me crying over my algebra homework around midnight. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" my mother had asked in her gentle way, settling beside me on the bed with that infinite patience that characterized everything she did. I told them about Miss Gray's assessment, watching their faces fall as they realized their daughter had been professionally labeled as mediocre. My father, who worked 2 jobs to afford our modest suburban home, had clenched his fists in rare anger. "She doesn't know you," he'd said firmly. "She doesn't see what we see." But their faith in me wasn't enough to counteract the authority of an official school counselor's assessment. If anything, it made me feel worse, like I was destined to disappoint the 2 people who believed in me most. That's when something shifted. A quiet fury began building in my chest, whispering dangerous thoughts. What if she's wrong? What if there's more to me than she can see? I'd always been drawn to computers, spending hours on our family's ancient desktop exploring the early internet, fascinated by how websites worked and wondering if I could build something similar. But I'd never considered it more than a casual interest, certainly not a talent worth developing. Miss Gray's dismissal changed that. If I was destined for mediocrity, I reasoned, then I had nothing to lose by trying something ambitious. Failure would just confirm what she already believed. I threw myself into programming with the desperate intensity of someone trying to prove their own existence. While other students socialized at the mall or played sports after school, I spent hours in the computer lab learning HTML, CSS, and JavaScript from online tutorials that loaded painfully slowly on our dial-up connection. Mr. Rodriguez, the computer science teacher, noticed my sudden dedication. A young educator in his 2nd year, he still believed students could surprise him. "You're here late again, Brooke," he observed one evening as I hunched over code that refused to compile correctly. "Just trying to figure this out," I'd mumbled, embarrassed by the attention. He'd looked over my shoulder at the screen, his eyebrows rising as he saw the complexity of what I was attempting, a basic e-commerce site with user authentication and database integration. This is advanced stuff. Where did you learn to do this? YouTube tutorials mostly, some programming forums. He'd been quiet for a long moment, studying the code with professional interest. Brooke, have you considered entering the regional coding competition this spring? The suggestion seemed absurd. I was the invisible girl, the one Miss Gray had labeled as average. Competitions were for confident students with natural talent and parental support, everything I lacked. I don't think I'm ready for something like that, I'd said automatically. Maybe not, Mr. Rodriguez had agreed. But what's the worst that could happen? You lose? So what? You'll have learned something in the process. The Washington State High School coding competition was held at the University of Washington on a crisp Saturday morning in April. I'd practiced for months, building increasingly complex applications, while Miss Gray's voice echoed in my head, average at best. My parents drove me to the competition despite having no understanding of what I'd be doing there. They sat in the gallery like proud but confused spectators at an event conducted in a foreign language. 150 students from across the state filled the computer science building, most of them accompanied by supportive teachers and parents who spoke fluently about algorithms and data structures. I felt like an imposter, a fraud who'd somehow snuck into a gathering of genuinely talented people. The competition had 3 rounds: a basic programming challenge, an algorithm optimization task, and a creative application development segment. I expected to be eliminated in the first round, but something magical happened when I sat down at the computer terminal. All the noise faded away, the nervous chatter of other competitors, the clicking of keyboards, the whispered encouragements from coaches. There was only me and the code, the logical beauty of problems that had clear solutions if you were patient enough to find them. The first challenge involved sorting algorithms. While other students frantically Googled syntax and implementation details, I found myself writing code from memory, drawing on hundreds of hours of late-night practice. The solution came naturally, elegantly, like a language I'd been born speaking. The second round required optimizing a pathfinding algorithm for efficiency. I remembered a technique I'd learned from an obscure programming forum, a clever use of dynamic programming that reduced computational complexity. My solution ran in a fraction of the time required by most other entries. By the final round, I'd reached something I'd never experienced before, a flow state where programming became as natural as breathing. The creative challenge asked us to build a social media application with specific features in just 2 hours. While other competitors struggled with basic functionality, I found myself adding extra features: user privacy controls, content filtering, mobile optimization, because the additional complexity felt exciting rather than overwhelming. When time was called, I submitted my application with shaking hands, still unable to believe I'd made it through all 3 rounds without catastrophic failure. The award ceremony took place in the university's main auditorium. Families and teachers packed into red velvet seats while competitors sat in the front rows, trying to manage their nervous energy. Ms. Gray had attended, not to support me, but because the school required a guidance counselor presence at major student events. Third place, the announcer began, goes to Kevin Walsh from Seattle Prep. Polite applause filled the auditorium. Kevin was a senior who'd won multiple math competitions and had already been accepted to Stanford. His victory surprised no one. Second place goes to Jennifer Lule from Bellevue High School. Jennifer was the daughter of 2 Microsoft engineers who'd been programming since elementary school. She stood gracefully, accepting her trophy with the poise of someone accustomed to academic success. I felt my stomach drop. If Jennifer, brilliant, experienced Jennifer, had only placed second, then my chances of placing at all seemed impossibly remote.
And first place, the announcer continued, his voice building dramatic tension, goes to... I found myself holding my breath, already composing the explanation I'd give my parents about why placing in the top 3 would have been unrealistic anyway. Brooke Chen from Riverside High School. The words seemed to echo in slow motion. Around me, the auditorium erupted in applause, but I couldn't process the sound. First place? Me? The invisible girl who'd been labeled as average? I stood on unsteady legs, walking toward the stage in a dreamlike trance. The trophy felt solid and real in my hands, proof that Ms. Gray had been wrong about at least one thing. From the stage, I could see the audience clearly, my parents beaming with pride and confusion, Mr. Rodriguez applauding enthusiastically, and Ms. Gray sitting near the back with an expression I couldn't read. After the ceremony, as families celebrated in the lobby with photos and congratulations, Ms. Gray approached me near the parking lot. She looked older somehow, more fragile than the authority figure who'd crushed my dreams 6 months earlier. "Congratulations," she said stiffly, the word seeming to stick in her throat. "Though I hope this doesn't give you unrealistic expectations about your future." Even in victory, she couldn't resist diminishing me. Even when presented with concrete evidence that she'd misjudged my potential, she clung to her original assessment rather than admit error. "Thank you," I had replied quietly, still too stunned by victory to feel anger. "I'll try to keep my expectations realistic." But privately, I wondered, if she'd been wrong about this, what else might she be wrong about? Word of my programming competition victory spread through Riverside High with the speed of particularly juicy gossip. Suddenly, teachers who'd never noticed me began offering encouragement. Classmates who'd treated me as furniture started acknowledging my existence. The chess club, previously too intimidated to approach me, invited me to join their programming subcommittee. But the most significant change was internal. For the first time in my life, I had evidence that I might be capable of more than mediocrity. The trophy sat on my desk at home like a talisman against self-doubt, proof that quiet persistence could triumph over louder confidence.
Miss Gray, however, seemed determined to minimize my breakthrough. When college application season arrived senior year, she scheduled mandatory meetings with all students to discuss realistic post-graduation plans. "Brooke," she'd said, consulting my file during our December meeting, "you've shown some aptitude for computer programming, which is encouraging. However, I want to make sure you're not overestimating your abilities based on one competition." I'd learned to steel myself against her assessments, but the dismissal still stung. One competition, as if winning a statewide academic contest was a fluke, rather than an achievement. "I've been accepted to MIT," I said quietly, sliding my acceptance letter across her desk, "with a partial scholarship." She'd studied the letter with the expression of someone examining suspicious evidence. "Technical schools can be very demanding," she'd warned, her voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. "The competition will be fierce, students from much more privileged backgrounds with extensive preparation." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "You don't belong there. You're not good enough. You'll fail and prove that I was right all along." "You might be happier at a community college," she'd continued. "Less pressure, more realistic expectations. You could study basic computer skills, maybe get a certification for office work." Office work? After winning the state programming competition? After being accepted to one of the world's premier technical universities? She was suggesting I prepare for a career as a data entry clerk? "Thank you for your concern," I'd replied with newfound firmness. "I'll keep that in mind." But I enrolled at MIT anyway, choosing to trust my own assessment of my abilities rather than hers. Cambridge in September felt like stepping into an alternate universe where intelligence was currency and innovation was religion.
MIT's campus buzzed with the energy of thousands of brilliant minds pushing the boundaries of human knowledge, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. My freshman dorm was a revelation. Hallways filled with students who spoke fluently about quantum computing and artificial intelligence, who stayed up until 3 a.m. not partying but debugging code or solving theoretical math problems for fun. These were my people, the quiet ones who found beauty in elegant algorithms and spent weekends building robots instead of attending social events. My roommate, Sarah, was a mechanical engineering major from a small town in Vermont who'd built her first computer from spare parts at age 12. She understood my background of being underestimated and dismissed. "High school guidance counselors are the worst," she'd said one night as we worked on separate programming assignments, our laptops glowing in the darkened dorm room. "They're failed teachers who think they understand potential better than the students themselves." Mine told me I'd never amount to anything, I admitted, surprised by how easily the words came. At MIT, being doubted by others seemed to be a common experience rather than a personal failing. "Good," Sarah had replied matter-of-factly. "Nothing motivates success like someone telling you it's impossible." She was right. My childhood experience of being dismissed and underestimated had become a superpower at MIT. While other students struggled with imposter syndrome, feeling like they didn't belong among such brilliant peers, I was comfortable with being underestimated. I'd spent years proving doubters wrong. My professors began to notice my work. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, not the senator, but equally formidable, taught my advanced algorithms course and became the first academic authority figure to see potential in me rather than limitations. "Miss Chen, your solution to the graph optimization problem was particularly elegant. Have you considered research as a career path?"
Research. The suggestion opened doors I'd never imagined walking through. Under Dr. Warren's mentorship, I began working on projects that pushed the boundaries of supply chain optimization, using machine learning algorithms to predict and prevent logistics bottlenecks before they occurred. The work was challenging in ways that made my brain hurt and my heart sing simultaneously. I spent 18-hour days in the lab fueled by coffee and the addictive rush of solving problems that had real-world applications. My sophomore year brought an unexpected opportunity. While struggling to order food between classes, campus dining halls were overcrowded and delivery services were unreliable. I had an idea for a streamlining app that could coordinate multiple orders, optimize delivery routes, and reduce wait times. Working with Sarah and 2 other students from my algorithms class, we built Eat Smart in 3 months of intensive development. The app launched as a campus-only service, but word spread quickly. Within 6 months, we had investor interest. Within a year, major food service companies were calling. "Brooke," Dr. Warren had said during one of our regular mentoring meetings, "you have a choice to make. You could accept job offers from any major tech company in the country, or you could take a terrifying leap into entrepreneurship." The decision felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that jumping might lead to flight or catastrophic failure. But I'd been making terrifying leaps since the day I decided to prove Miss Gray wrong. I chose to jump. Chen Digital Solutions began in my studio apartment 3 blocks from MIT campus, furnished with borrowed equipment, inflatable furniture, and a prayer to whatever gods watch over naive entrepreneurs. My office was a folding table next to the window. My server room was a closet filled with humming computers that made the apartment feel like a sauna in summer. The first year was a masterclass in barely controlled chaos. I wore every hat in the company: CEO, lead developer, customer service representative, bookkeeper, janitor, and chief morale officer for a team that initially consisted of just me and occasionally Sarah when she had free time between mechanical engineering classes. 18-hour days became the norm. Breakfast was coffee and whatever snacks I could eat while coding. Lunch was more coffee and perhaps a protein bar if I remembered to buy groceries. Dinner was ramen or whatever delivery food hadn't been claimed by my neighbors, a surprisingly common occurrence in our cash-strapped graduate student building. The loneliness was brutal. While my former classmates were landing prestigious jobs at Google and Microsoft, collecting steady paychecks, and earning respect from family members who could finally understand what their children did for a living, I was bootstrapped at a company that might fail spectacularly at any moment. Miss Gray's voice haunted my darkest moments. Average at best? During particularly difficult debugging sessions that stretched past midnight, when potential clients rejected our proposals and bank account balances dwindled toward zero, I wondered if she'd been right all along. Maybe I was just a mediocre person with temporarily inflated expectations. But gradually, incrementally, we grew. Our first major contract came from a local restaurant chain struggling with delivery coordination. Our optimization algorithm reduced their average delivery time by 37%, while cutting operational costs by 22%. Word spread through Boston's tight-knit food service community. More clients followed: a regional grocery chain, a medical supply company, and a logistics firm that shipped products across New England. Each success built credibility, and credibility attracted bigger opportunities.
By the end of year 2, I'd moved from my studio apartment to a small office space in Cambridge, complete with real furniture and a coffee machine that didn't require pleating to function properly. Sarah graduated and joined the company full-time as our head of hardware integration. We hired our first employees, recent graduates hungry for the chance to work on cutting-edge problems without the bureaucracy of established operations. Year 3 brought our breakthrough contract. Amazon's regional fulfillment center wanted to pilot our predictive logistics system. If successful, the contract would be worth $50 million over 5 years. If unsuccessful, we'd be finished as a company. The pressure was crushing. We had 6 months to prove our algorithms could handle Amazon's volume and complexity. 6 months to justify every 18-hour day, every ramen dinner, every moment of doubt and determination that had brought us to this point. We worked like our lives depended on success, because in many ways they did. I slept in the office more nights than not, surrounded by whiteboards covered in equations and flowcharts that mapped our assault on logistics inefficiency. The pilot launch was scheduled for Black Friday, the ultimate stress test for any supply chain system. If our algorithms could optimize Amazon's fulfillment during the busiest shopping day of the year, they could handle anything. I spent Thanksgiving Day in the office monitoring system performance while my parents ate turkey and worried about their daughter who'd chosen such an uncertain path. At 11:47 p.m. on November 24th, our optimization system went live across Amazon's regional network. For the next 72 hours, I barely left my desk. We monitored metrics obsessively: delivery times, routing efficiency, customer satisfaction scores, and system stability. Every number was scrutinized, every anomaly investigated. When the weekend ended and final reports were compiled, the results exceeded our most optimistic projections. Delivery times improved by 41%. Operational costs decreased by 33%. Customer satisfaction ratings reached historical highs. Amazon offered us a 5-year exclusive contract worth $120 million. Success brought new challenges that no amount of coding expertise had prepared me for. Suddenly, Chen Digital Solutions was a company that mattered, a player in the logistics optimization space, with major clients and serious competitors. We moved from our cramped Cambridge office to a sleek facility in downtown Boston, complete with ergonomic workstations, a fully equipped kitchen, and enough space for the 60 employees we'd hired in the previous year. I traded my folding table and inflatable chair for a real office with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that hadn't been assembled with an Allen wrench.
The transition from scrappy startup to legitimate company required learning skills they don't teach in computer science classes. I studied business management, financial planning, and human resources with the same intensity I'd once applied to algorithms. Leadership, I discovered, was far more complex than any programming challenge I'd encountered. Media attention followed our Amazon success. Forbes featured us in their Companies to Watch section. TechCrunch covered our expansion into pharmaceutical supply chain optimization. I found myself giving interviews and conference presentations, trying to explain how a quiet girl from suburban Seattle had built a company that was revolutionizing logistics. "What's your secret?" journalists would ask, expecting some profound insight about innovation or market timing. "I was lucky enough to be underestimated," I'd reply, watching their confused expressions as they tried to understand how doubt could be an advantage.
The growth was intoxicating but exhausting. Every month brought new opportunities and new pressures. We expanded into healthcare logistics, optimizing medical supply delivery for hospital networks. We developed algorithms for retail inventory management that could predict demand fluctuations with unprecedented accuracy. We hired specialists in machine learning, data science, and operations research. By year 5, Chen Digital Solutions employed over 100 people across 3 offices. Our client list read like a Fortune 500 directory: Amazon, Walmart, CVS Health, FedEx, UPS. We'd become the quiet giant of logistics optimization, the company that made everything else run more smoothly. Going public felt like the natural next step. The IPO process was a 6-month gauntlet of financial audits, regulatory compliance, and investor presentations. Investment banks courted us with promises of valuations that seemed surreal, numbers that would have been unimaginable when I was eating ramen in my studio apartment. The day Chen Digital Solutions went public, I stood on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, watching our stock ticker, CDSI, scroll across electronic displays. Opening price, $47 per share. Market cap, $2.8 billion. At 28, I was the CEO of a publicly traded company worth more than some small country's annual GDP. The financial press called me an overnight success, conveniently forgetting the years of 18-hour days and ramen dinners that had made the overnight part possible. Tech magazines featured me on covers with headlines about disruption and innovation, using buzzwords that made my achievements sound inevitable rather than improbable. But I remembered where it had all started, in Miss Gray's office, with an assessment that had labeled me as average at best. Which brought me back to that morning, 5 years after our IPO, when I found Marcus Gray's resume in my inbox. I'd built an empire that employed over 300 people across 6 offices. Our algorithms optimized supply chains for companies that served hundreds of millions of customers. We held 47 patents for innovations that had fundamentally changed how goods moved through the modern economy. And now, Miss Gray's son needed a job. I studied Marcus's application with the analytical skills that had made me successful. Recent college graduate from Washington State University, 2.8 GPA in business administration, 6 months at a marketing firm before being laid off due to budget cuts, though our background check revealed he'd been terminated for attendance issues and missed deadlines. A scattering of retail and food service jobs, none lasting more than 8 months. His cover letter was a masterpiece of empty corporate speak, passionate about leveraging synergistic solutions to drive value-added outcomes in dynamic market environments, the kind of buzzword soup that said everything and nothing simultaneously. His references were thin: a community college professor who remembered him vaguely, a supervisor from a restaurant job who'd written 2 sentences of faint praise, and his mother. Of course his mother was a reference. Any rational hiring manager would have rejected his application within 30 seconds. His qualifications were mediocre, his work history was problematic, and his interview would likely confirm what his resume suggested: another entitled millennial who expected opportunities without earning them. But this wasn't about rational hiring decisions. This was about Miss Gray and the conversation that had shaped my entire adult life. I could have simply sent a standard rejection email. Quick, clean, professional. Marcus would never know why he'd been denied, and Miss Gray would never realize that the CEO who'd passed on her son was the same girl she'd dismissed 15 years earlier. But I'd built my company on the principle that everyone deserved to be seen clearly, to be evaluated on their potential rather than their packaging, even when that evaluation revealed uncomfortable truths. I decided to conduct the interview myself. The weekend before Marcus's scheduled interview, I found myself researching Miss Gray with the thoroughness of a private investigator. Social media provided glimpses of her life, family photos featuring Marcus and his father, vacation pictures from modest trips to national parks, posts about her work at Riverside High School that painted her as a dedicated educator beloved by students and parents. The cognitive dissonance was jarring. Online, she appeared to be the kind of guidance counselor who genuinely cared about student success, who celebrated academic achievements and offered encouraging words during difficult times. Nothing like the woman who'd systematically dismantled my confidence during our brief interactions. Had I misremembered? Had my teenage insecurities colored my perception of conversations that were actually well-intentioned but poorly delivered? I dug deeper, searching for other perspectives on her counseling style. Alumni forums mentioned her occasionally, always in neutral terms, describing her as experienced and professional, but never as particularly inspiring or supportive. No glowing tributes from students whose lives she'd changed, but also no complaints about her dismissive attitude. Perhaps I'd been an outlier. Perhaps her assessment of me had been the exception rather than the rule, a moment of unprofessional honesty rather than a pattern of crushing student dreams. Or perhaps she'd learned to be more diplomatic over the years, tempering her bluntness without changing her fundamental belief that most students were destined for mediocrity. I spent Sunday evening in my penthouse apartment, 40 floors above Seattle, with views of the Sound and the Olympics, trying to understand my own motivations. Was this about justice, revenge, closure? Some combination of all three. The apartment reflected my journey from invisible teenager to successful entrepreneur. Minimalist furniture that emphasized clean lines and functionality, original artwork from local artists I discovered and supported, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with technical manuals and business biographies, everything chosen deliberately, nothing left to chance. I'd worked too hard to build this life to let it be compromised by petty vindictiveness. But I'd also learned that sometimes the most important conversations happen when you're brave enough to confront uncomfortable truths. Marcus Gray would get a fair interview. His mother would get a long overdue reality check. And I would get the closure that came from proving, once and for all, that she'd been spectacularly wrong about my potential. Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Seattle weather that matched my complicated emotions. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a tailored navy blazer that projected authority without arrogance, minimal jewelry that suggested confidence without ostentation, the kind of professional polish that came from years of investor meetings and board presentations. Our office building reflected the company's evolution from scrappy startup to industry leader. 43 floors of glass and steel in the heart of Seattle's tech corridor, with Chen Digital Solutions occupying the top 5 floors. The lobby featured our logo etched in brushed aluminum, interlocking C and D letters that formed an infinity symbol, representing the endless optimization loops that drove our algorithms. I positioned myself near the lobby windows at 9:45 a.m., ostensibly reviewing market reports on my tablet, but actually watching the street for familiar faces. The morning commute flowed around me, Tech workers clutching coffee cups like lifelines, delivery drivers navigating the complex dance of urban logistics that our algorithms had helped choreograph, the constant motion of a city that never quite stopped moving. At 9:52, I spotted them. A nervous young man in an ill-fitting suit, accompanied by an older woman whose posture suggested she was accustomed to taking charge of situations. Even from 40 floors up, Miss Gray looked exactly as I remembered her. Wire-rimmed glasses, sensible shoes, the slightly hunched shoulders of someone who'd spent decades hunched over student files and academic assessments. They entered our building's lobby like tourists visiting a foreign country, Marcus gesturing at the high-tech surroundings while his mother surveyed everything with critical eyes. I watched them approach the reception desk, watched our receptionist, trained to be professionally friendly with all visitors, direct them toward the elevator bank. Conference Room B was on the 38th floor, deliberately chosen for its intimidating view and formal atmosphere. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains, while the conference table, a massive slab of reclaimed wood from an old-growth forest, suggested permanence and authority. I'd arranged the room carefully, Marcus's resume and supporting documents spread across the table where I could reference them easily, my business card positioned where Miss Gray couldn't miss it, a pitcher of water and glasses to suggest hospitality while maintaining professional distance. At exactly 10 a.m., I made my entrance. The sound of my heels clicking against polished hardwood announced my arrival before they saw me. Both Marcus and his mother looked up as I entered, and I watched recognition flicker across Miss Gray's face like a match being struck in darkness. "Good morning," I said warmly, extending my hand to Marcus with the practiced ease of someone who'd conducted thousands of professional meetings. "I'm Brooke Chen, CEO of Chen Digital Solutions. Thank you for your interest in our company." Marcus shook my hand with nervous energy, clearly unaware of the family history that had brought us together. "Thank you for the opportunity, Miss Chen. I'm really excited about the possibility of joining your team." His grip was weak, his eye contact fleeting, small details that spoke to confidence issues that probably ran deeper than professional inexperience. "And you must be Marcus's mother," I continued, turning to Miss Gray with the same professional warmth I'd shown her son. "How nice that you could accompany him today." "Miss Gray," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Up close, she looked older than her online photos suggested. 15 years of high school guidance counseling had left their mark in the lines around her eyes and the gray streaks in her hair that she'd stopped trying to hide. "We're grateful for this opportunity," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she fell back on practiced politeness. I gestured for them to sit across from me, noting how Miss Gray positioned herself slightly forward, a subtle signal that she intended to participate actively in her son's interview, the same controlling instinct that probably shaped every aspect of Marcus's life, from his choice of college major to his approach to job hunting. "Please, make yourselves comfortable," I said, settling into my chair with the relaxed confidence that came from being in home territory. "Can I offer you water? Coffee? Anything else?" They both declined, though Marcus looked like he could have used caffeine to calm his obvious nerves. I took my seat across from them, Marcus's resume spread before me like evidence in a trial. The silence stretched for a moment as I pretended to review information I had already memorized, letting the weight of the situation settle over all of us. "Marcus," I said finally, looking up with the kind of direct eye contact that made interviewees either rise to the occasion or crumble under pressure. "Tell me about your career goals." He launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech, his words tumbling out in a rush of nervous energy. "I'm passionate about leveraging my skills in a dynamic environment where I can contribute to innovative solutions while growing professionally and personally. I believe your company represents the kind of forward-thinking organization where I can make a meaningful impact." It was corporate speak at its worst, a string of buzzwords that communicated nothing about his actual interests, skills, or understanding of what our company did.
I'd heard variations of this speech hundreds of times from candidates who'd confused memorizing generic phrases with preparing for an interview. "That's very comprehensive," I replied diplomatically. "But can you be more specific about what draws you to Chen Digital Solutions? What do you know about our work in logistics optimization?" Marcus glanced at his mother, a brief look that revealed everything about their dynamic. She gave him an almost imperceptible nod, and he launched into another prepared response about synergistic supply chain solutions that made it clear he'd spent more time memorizing buzzwords than researching our actual business model. Miss Gray occasionally nodded encouragingly, but her attention remained fixed on me with growing unease. I could see her mental wheels turning, trying to reconcile the successful woman before her with the awkward teenager she'd dismissed so casually. "Your employment history is brief," I observed, turning to a section of his resume I'd highlighted in red. "Only 6 months at your previous position before being laid off. Can you explain the circumstances?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his polished demeanor cracking slightly. "Budget cuts," he said quickly, the words coming out too fast to be entirely truthful. "Last hired, first fired, you know? It's just the reality of today's economy." I'd done my research, of course. A 5-minute phone call to his former employer had revealed that Marcus Gray had been terminated for performance issues, chronic lateness, missed deadlines, and a tendency to blame external factors for problems that required personal accountability. The kind of employee who consumes management energy without producing corresponding value. "I see," I said, making a note in his file that I am sure he could see. "And what would you say is your greatest weakness?" "I sometimes work too hard," he replied without hesitation, delivering the line with the confidence of someone who'd practiced it in front of a mirror. "I get so focused on doing quality work that I lose track of time." Another cliché, another red flag. In my experience, people who claimed to work too hard were usually the ones who confused busy work with productive effort, who stayed late at the office not because they were accomplishing important tasks, but because they couldn't organize their time effectively. "Interesting perspective," I mused, leaning back in my chair. "In the logistics industry, time management is crucial. Our algorithms optimize delivery schedules down to the minute. How would you handle working in an environment where losing track of time could cost clients thousands of dollars?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, then looked at his mother for guidance that she couldn't provide without making the situation worse. That's a good point," he stammered. "I guess I'd need to be more mindful of time constraints in a professional setting." It was an honest answer, at least, the first genuine response he'd given since sitting down. But it also revealed a fundamental lack of preparation and self-awareness that didn't bode well for his professional prospects. "Your references are somewhat limited," I continued, consulting another section of his file. "No academic recommendations, no professional mentors. That's unusual for someone just starting their career." This was where most entry-level candidates would explain their networking efforts, discuss professors who'd influenced their thinking, or mention supervisors who'd provided guidance during internships. Marcus had none of these connections, suggesting either a remarkably passive approach to his education and early career, or a pattern of burning bridges that made people reluctant to vouch for him. Marcus fumbled for an explanation, while his mother leaned forward, her protective instincts overriding professional boundaries. "My son is very dedicated," she interjected, her voice carrying the defensive tone of a parent accustomed to making excuses. "He just needs someone to give him a chance." The statement revealed everything about their relationship and nothing good about Marcus's readiness for professional independence. At 23, he still required parental intervention to navigate job interviews, a red flag that suggested problems with self-advocacy, confidence, and personal responsibility.
Of course, I replied smoothly, maintaining professional composure while internally noting the dynamic. Everyone deserves opportunities. I paused, letting the words hang in the air before continuing. Though I'm curious, Ms. Gray, in your professional experience as a guidance counselor, how important do you think it is to have realistic expectations about one's potential? The question was a precision strike, designed to force her to confront the philosophy that had shaped her career and, indirectly, my own trajectory. I watched her face carefully as the implications sank in. She paled visibly, her hands tightening in her lap as she finally understood that this wasn't coincidence or professional courtesy. This was a reckoning 15 years in the making. That depends on the individual, she stammered, her professional composure cracking like ice under pressure. Absolutely, I agreed, my voice remaining steady and professional despite the emotional undertones. Some people surprise you. They exceed every prediction, every limitation others place on them. I met her gaze directly, holding it until she looked away. They prove that being underestimated can be a tremendous advantage. Marcus looked between us with growing confusion, sensing undercurrents he couldn't identify. The tension in the room was palpable now, a charged atmosphere that had nothing to do with his job interview and everything to do with a conversation that had been 15 years in the making. Tell me about your long-term goals, I said, returning my attention to Marcus with deliberate normalcy. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? It was a standard interview question, but one that often revealed whether candidates had given serious thought to their career trajectory or were simply seeking any available job without considering how it fit into their larger life plan. I'd like to be in a leadership position, he replied, falling back on another generic response. Managing teams and driving strategic initiatives. Leadership is earned, not assigned, I observed. What have you done to develop leadership skills? Have you managed projects, led teams, taken initiative in challenging situations? The question exposed another gap in his experience and preparation. Leadership required a track record of taking responsibility, making difficult decisions, and inspiring others to follow your vision. Marcus had none of these experiences, just vague aspirations based on titles rather than competencies. I led group projects in college, he offered weakly. Can you give me a specific example? What was the project, what challenges did you face, and how did you handle them? The specificity of the question clearly caught him off guard. Most candidates, even entry-level ones, could discuss academic or extracurricular experiences that demonstrated leadership potential. Marcus struggled to articulate even a basic example, suggesting either a remarkably passive college experience or an inability to recognize and communicate his own contributions. As he stumbled through a vague description of a marketing class presentation, I found myself feeling something unexpected. Sympathy. Not for his lack of qualifications, that was his responsibility to address, but for the parental dynamic that had probably contributed to his struggles with independence and self-advocacy. Miss Gray had created a dependent rather than preparing an adult for professional success. Her protective instincts had robbed Marcus of opportunities to fail, learn, and develop resilience. In trying to shield him from disappointment, she'd left him unprepared for a world that required personal accountability and self-direction. Let's talk about problem solving, I said, shifting to a different line of questioning. Describe a time when you faced a significant challenge and how you overcame it. This was another standard interview question, but one that revealed character and resilience more than technical skills. I'd learned to listen not just for the challenge itself, but for how candidates framed their role in both creating and resolving difficulties. Marcus hesitated, his eyes darting to his mother before returning to me. Well, there was the situation at my last job. The one where you were laid off due to budget cuts? I prompted gently. Right. It was really challenging because, well, the whole company was struggling with efficiency issues. Processes weren't optimized, communication was poor, and management wasn't providing clear direction. It was a masterclass in external attribution, describing challenges in terms of other people's failures while positioning himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. No mention of what he'd done to address the problems he'd identified, no acknowledgement of his own role in the outcomes he'd experienced. That does sound challenging, I agreed. What specific steps did you take to address these issues? I tried to be a team player, he replied vaguely. I did my best to work within the existing systems. But did you propose solutions, suggest improvements, take initiative to address the problems you identified? The questions revealed the gap between recognizing problems and taking ownership of solutions. Marcus could identify issues, but seemed to expect others to fix them, a passive approach that didn't align with our company culture of innovation and proactive problem solving. I mentioned some ideas to my supervisor, he said defensively, but they weren't really interested in feedback from entry-level employees. Another external attribution, another missed opportunity to demonstrate leadership, persistence, or creative thinking. I'd built my career on refusing to accept limitations imposed by others, on finding ways to make my voice heard, even when I was the youngest, quietest person in the room. I understand, I replied diplomatically. Sometimes organizational cultures aren't receptive to new ideas, but successful professionals find ways to create value regardless of structural constraints. Miss Gray had remained silent during this exchange, but I could see her growing discomfort as her son's weaknesses became increasingly apparent. This wasn't the confident, capable young man she'd probably described to friends and family. This was someone who'd been sheltered from accountability and hadn't developed the resilience that comes from overcoming genuine challenges. Let's discuss your technical skills, I continued, consulting his resume. You list proficiency in Microsoft Office and basic social media management. Can you elaborate on your experience with data analysis or project management software? I'm a quick learner, Marcus replied, falling back on perhaps the most overused phrase in interview history. I pick up new systems easily. That's great, I said, but can you give me examples of complex systems you've mastered? Software platforms, analytical tools, anything that required a significant learning curve. The specificity of the question again revealed gaps in his background. Most recent graduates, even those without extensive work experience, could discuss software they'd learned for academic projects or personal interests. Marcus seemed to have coasted through college without encountering anything that challenged his technical comfort zone. Well, I used Excel for some class projects. Excel. Basic spreadsheet software that millions of people used for simple tasks. Not exactly the kind of technical proficiency that would set him apart in a competitive job market. I glanced at Miss Gray, who was watching this interview unfold with what appeared to be dawning realization. Her son, the young man she'd been so eager to help, was demonstrating exactly the kind of mediocrity she'd once predicted would define my future. The irony was almost too perfect. Marcus, I said, closing his file with deliberate finality, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today. We'll be in touch with our decision shortly. It was the polite dismissal that concluded every unsuccessful interview, delivered with the professional courtesy that softened obvious rejection. Marcus looked confused, clearly sensing that things hadn't gone well, but unable to pinpoint exactly where he'd lost control of the conversation. Thank you, he said, standing awkwardly and extending his hand for another weak handshake. I really hope to hear from you soon. His mother rose beside him, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she were afraid to say or do something that might make the situation worse, which it probably would have. As they reached the conference room door, I spoke again,
my voice carrying just enough authority to stop them both. "Miss Gray?" She turned back reluctantly, her face pale and her eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from realizing you're about to be held accountable for past actions. "Do you remember what you told me about accepting mediocrity, about being happy with an ordinary life?" The words hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus looked between us with growing confusion, finally beginning to understand that this interaction was more than his job interview. "Brooke, she began, her voice cracking slightly. "You were wrong," I said simply, my tone matter-of-fact, rather than triumphant. The silence that followed was profound. Marcus stared at his mother with dawning understanding, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Miss Gray looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. "I remember you," she whispered. You were so quiet. You thought I'd never amount to anything," I finished for her. "Average at best," you said. Marcus's face cycled through confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been anger as he realized his mother's past had just sabotaged his present.
"I was trying to help you develop realistic expectations," Ms. Gray said defensively, her professional training kicking in even as her personal world crumbled. So many students set themselves up for disappointment by aiming too high. "Aiming too high?" I repeated, gesturing around the conference room with its panoramic views and symbols of corporate success. "Is that what you call building a company worth $3 billion? The number landed like a physical blow. Marcus stepped backward slightly, while his mother gripped the back of her chair for support. "I never imagined," she began. "No," I agreed. "You didn't. That was the problem." I stood up, moving to the window that offered views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. From this height, Seattle looked manageable, organized, a city that could be understood and optimized with the right algorithms and sufficient processing power. "Do you know what I've learned in the 15 years since you told me I'd never amount to anything?" I asked, not turning around. "I've learned that the people who matter most in determining your future are you. Everyone else is just noise." When I turned back to face them, Ms. Gray was crying. Not sobbing, but quiet tears that spoke to genuine remorse rather than self-pity. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I was wrong about you. Completely wrong." The apology was unexpected, and it carried more weight than I'd anticipated. For 15 years, I'd imagined this moment as pure vindication, a chance to prove my worth to someone who doubted it. But seeing her genuine distress made victory feel more complicated than I'd expected. "I accept your apology," I said after a moment, "but the person who really needs to hear it isn't me." I looked at Marcus, who was still processing the revelation that his mother had crushed another student's dreams with the same casual dismissiveness she'd probably used with dozens of others over the years. "How many other students did you discourage?" I asked her directly. "How many other quiet kids did you write off as average?" She didn't answer, but her expression suggested the number wasn't small. "Your son seems like a decent person, but he's been handicapped by the same thinking that led you to underestimate me. You've protected him from failure so completely that he's never learned to overcome challenges independently." Marcus flinched at the assessment, but he didn't argue with it. Perhaps he'd been feeling the effects of his mother's overprotection without understanding its source. Real strength comes from being underestimated and proving doubters wrong. It comes from failing and getting back up. It comes from taking responsibility for your own success instead of expecting others to hand it to you. After they left, I sat alone in the conference room for nearly an hour, staring out at the Seattle skyline and processing emotions I hadn't fully anticipated. The victory felt different than I'd imagined, less triumphant, more melancholy. Ms. Gray had been wrong about my potential, but she was also a tired woman trying to protect her struggling son from disappointment. Her overprotective instincts had created the very mediocrity she'd once predicted would define my life. The irony was perfect and tragic. I made my decision about Marcus's application quickly. The rejection letter was professional but firm. He lacked the qualifications, work ethic, and independence we required for any position at Chen Digital Solutions. However, I included information about coding boot camps and professional development programs we sponsored for underrepresented students. Real opportunities that require effort and growth, not handouts. Chances to develop skills and resilience that might eventually lead to genuine career success.
The letter also included a personal note. Your mother was wrong about my potential 15 years ago. Don't let her limitations become yours. Prove that you're capable of more than anyone expects, including yourself. I never heard from either of them again, but I made it a point to follow their stories from a distance. Marcus eventually found his path, though it took several years and multiple failures. He discovered a natural talent for graphic design and built a small but successful freelance business creating marketing materials for local restaurants and retail shops. Not the corporate success his mother had envisioned, but honest work that utilized his actual strengths rather than pursuing careers that didn't suit his temperament. Miss Gray retired the following year. I wondered sometimes if our encounter had prompted reflection on her role in shaping young people's futures. I hoped it had. The experience with Marcus and his mother reinforced lessons I'd been learning throughout my entrepreneurial journey. Building a successful company required more than technical skills or business acumen. It demanded the ability to see potential where others saw limitations, to believe in possibilities that hadn't yet been proven. I began visiting local high schools regularly, speaking to students who reminded me of my younger self. Shy kids who sat in the back of classrooms, brilliant minds convinced they were ordinary, teenagers whose guidance counselors had probably written them off as average. I always told them the same thing. The person who matters most in determining your future is you. Everyone else is just noise. Some of them listened, some of them didn't, but the ones who did, the ones who decided to prove their doubters wrong, often surprised everyone, including themselves. Chen Digital Solutions grew beyond my wildest teenage dreams. We expanded internationally, opened offices in London and Tokyo, and developed algorithms that optimize supply chains for companies serving hundreds of millions of customers worldwide. We employed over 1,000 people across 6 continents, each of them contributing to a mission that had started with a quiet girl trying to prove she was worth more than average. The media continued to call me an overnight success, a narrative that was convenient but fundamentally false. Success had taken 15 years of 18-hour days, countless failures, and the kind of persistence that comes from being underestimated so completely that you have nothing left to lose. 10 years after my encounter with Marcus and Miss Gray, I established the Chen Foundation for Educational Excellence. Our mission was simple: identify and support students whose potential had been overlooked by traditional academic assessment methods. We provided scholarships for coding boot camps, mentorship programs that connected underestimated students with successful professionals, and grants for innovative educational programs that recognized multiple forms of intelligence and talent. Our first scholarship recipient was a quiet girl from rural Montana, whose guidance counselor had suggested she consider more realistic career goals than computer science. She's now a software engineer at NASA, working on algorithms that optimize satellite communication networks. Our second recipient was a young man from inner-city Detroit, whose teachers had written him off as a discipline problem. He's now the CTO of a cybersecurity startup that protects financial institutions from sophisticated digital attacks. The foundation grew to support hundreds of students annually, each of them carrying forward the lesson that other people's limitations don't have to become their own reality. I kept Miss Gray's assessment in a frame on my office wall. Average at best.
not as a reminder of past hurt, but as evidence of how wrong even professionals can be when they mistake quiet strength for weakness, when they confuse conformity with capability. The shy teenagers who visited our offices often noticed the framed quote and asked about its significance. I would tell them about a guidance counselor who'd underestimated a student so completely that she accidentally created the motivation for extraordinary success. Sometimes, I would explain, the most valuable thing someone can do is doubt you completely, because there's nothing quite like proving them spectacularly wrong. 15 years after founding Chen Digital Solutions, I received an unexpected email from Riverside High School. They were renovating their guidance office and had found boxes of old student files in storage. Among them was my complete academic record, including handwritten notes from Ms. Gray. The file made for interesting reading. Her assessment of my potential had been even more damning than I'd remembered. Limited academic ability, poorer social skills, unlikely to succeed in competitive environments, recommend community college, and realistic career expectations. She'd been wrong about every single prediction. The irony wasn't lost on me that her professional assessment, intended to protect me from disappointment, had become the fuel for achievements she deemed impossible. I donated the file to our company museum, where it sits alongside patents, awards, and artifacts from our growth, from startup to industry leader. New employees often ask about its significance, and I tell them the same story I tell everyone. Underestimation can be a superpower if you're brave enough to prove the doubters wrong. The museum also includes photos from our various office openings, product launches, and corporate milestones. In many of them, I'm the same quiet person I've always been, just someone who learned to channel introversion into focused determination. The transformation wasn't about becoming someone different. It was about refusing to accept other people's limitations as permanent truth. Chen Digital Solutions continues to grow, innovate, and employ thousands of people who might have been overlooked by traditional hiring practices. We've learned to see potential where others see problems, to value persistence over pedigree, to understand that the loudest voices in the room aren't always the most valuable. My story isn't unique. Every successful company, every meaningful innovation, and every breakthrough that changes how we live and work begins with someone who refused to accept conventional wisdom about their limitations. The difference between average and extraordinary isn't talent, luck, or circumstance. It's the willingness to keep working when others have given up, to believe in possibilities that haven't yet been proven, to understand that the most dangerous words in any language are, "You'll never amount to anything." Ms. Gray taught me that lesson better than any motivational speaker ever could have. Her doubt became my determination. Her dismissal became my driving force. Her prediction of mediocrity became the foundation for extraordinary success. For that, I'll always be grateful. Sometimes the most profound gifts come disguised as insults. Sometimes the people who doubt you most completely are actually preparing you for the greatest triumphs of your life. Sometimes the quiet ones really do surprise everyone, including themselves. As Brooke's journey reaches its conclusion, I'm curious which moment resonated most powerfully with you. Was it the initial dismissal that sparked her transformation, the years of grinding determination that built her empire, or the confrontation that brought her face to face with the woman who tried to limit her dreams? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If her story of persistence and vindication inspired you, please subscribe and like for more tales of resilience from people who refuse to be defined by others' limitations. Your support fuels our community of survivors who understand that the best response to doubt is often spectacular success.